talking of 1923, which is almost a century ago, a Russian painter called Nicholas Roerich left his country. In fact, he was in the United States at that time, and he decided to launch this expedition to what to him was an unknown part of the world, essentially the Himalayas and the heights of Central Asia and the Tibetan Plateau. So all these paintings you see essentially emanate from that journey he made. And to me, they encapsulate the idea of the Himalaya. For me as an Indian, for me as a Hindu who's always been brought up to venerate these mountains, these paintings of Nicholas Roerich, you see his picture there, embody a very sacred meaning. And I'm sure all of you who see the beauty of these pictures will share the excitement that I feel when I look at them. So Nicholas Roerich, of course, is long gone, and 70, 80 years down the line, the situation in the Himalayas is so different from what he pictured in these images. Today, when you look at the entire Himalayan belt, of course, you see that many, many countries have stakes in what happens there. 100 years ago, you had colonial empires, you had borders just beginning to be drawn. But down the line, through the troubled decades of the 20th century, through the divisions of ideologies, through the emergence of newly independent nations, you saw boundaries coming up, you saw sovereignties being contested, and you saw a new concept of the Himalaya emerge. Today, when you look at the stretch from the Hindu Kush to the mountains of Myanmar, as one of our speakers early this morning said, apart from the topography and apart from the effects of global warming and climate change and the pressures of population and the compulsions and the challenges of sustainable development, you see so many threats to human security. You see the threat of terrorism. You see the security threat from unresolved borders, territorial disputes. You see the lack of communication, the lack of knowledge of each other. You see the erosion of cultural identities, the destruction of heritage, all these issues that we referred to in our discussions this morning. And I think, therefore, that the challenge before us is to see how we are able to mitigate, if not eliminate, these differences, and how, as it was said long ago, we build common ground even while we reserve our differences. I think that was something that Premier Chou En-lai said in the 50s, and with reference to the border disputes between India and China. Not much has changed in that regard, but what has happened to the people in between? I always refer to these people of the Himalaya as the people in between. They were used to a revolving door concept of coming and going, straddling borders, going beyond sovereignties, and that doesn't exist anymore. Do you remember that in the 50s of the last century, the first intergovernmental agreement between India and China, which came to be known as the Panchsheel Agreement of 1954, essentially dealt with this region because it dealt with trade and intercourse between the Tibet region of China and India. And the preamble to that agreement set out the Panchsheel, or the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, which came to define ultimately the conference at Bandung in Indonesia, It came to underpin the non-aligned movement, the much misunderstood, much maligned non-aligned movement. But the validity of those principles, the importance of those principles, to my mind, has not gone away, because they speak of not only of coexistence, they speak of cooperation, they speak of non-interference, they speak of the peaceful settlement of disputes, they speak about the elimination of conflict. And I think that is what our region needs, because otherwise, not many people outside the Himalayas perhaps understand the need for a Himalayan consensus. When I've talked about a Himalayan consensus, when I spoke about it soon after the first summit that we had, there was not much name recognition of the concept. There's a lot of cynicism in our world today. There's a lot of defeatism. There's a lot of unwillingness to accept perhaps revolutionary new ideas. And this is a revolutionary concept, the concept of a Himalayan consensus. So I think the challenge, as your discussions and deliberations go forward, as you build this consortium of think tanks, or as you talk about the Silk Road dialogues, or you speak of more communication between young people and heritage preservation, this is the challenge you're going to face. How are you going to seed this idea in the larger public domain? How is your public diplomacy going to work more effectively in order to ensure that this idea takes root, that people become passionately enthused about the need for a Himalayan consensus? And I think that is the challenge before us. Otherwise, we will continue to meet in Kathmandu year after year in our sequestered, council, as it were. But how are we going to propagate this idea? I think that is the challenge that lies before us. Are we, you spoke of a Himalayan council, I think somebody said today. But even before that, taking a cue from what the Panchsheel agreement said, can we put together a Himalayan Charter, perhaps? A kind of a declaration, a charter to begin with, that will enunciate the principles involved in what it means to be truly Himalayan, to really rise above, the differences that separate us today. And I'd like to read a few words from Nicholas Roerich's Altai Himalaya. I notice Altai Himalaya is one of the sponsors of this conference. And the words are beautiful, and I thought I should share that with you. He wrote, two worlds find expression in the Himalayas. One is the world of the soil, full of the enchantment of these paths. Deep ravines and grotesque hills rear up to the cloud line, into which melts the smoke of villages and monasteries. And that's what you see in the pictures. Upon the heights gleam banners or stupas. The ascending mountain passes curve with sharp turns. Eagles vie in their flight with the colorful kites flown by the villagers. In the bamboo stalks and amid the fern, the sleek body of a tiger or a leopard adding a glimmer of rich supplementary color. On the branches skulk the dwarfed bears, and a horde of bearded monkeys often escorts the solitary pilgrim. An earthly world this, full of diversities. A stately larch stands beside a blooming rhododendron. All is entangled. Remember, all is entangled. And all this earthly wealth shades into the blue mist of the rolling distances. A chain of clouds crowns the lowering mist. Above this synthetic picture, it is strange, unexpectedly startling to behold new ramparts mounting the clouds. Above the nebulous waves, above the twilight, glimmer the sparkling snows. Erect, infinitely beauteous, stand these dazzling, impassable peaks. Two distinct worlds intersected by a mist. The other day I saw in the British Museum in London an old Tibetan map, and it wasn't the map that you see in modern cartography. It was essentially a map of stupas and village communities and rivers. You know, rivers, the question of water, I think, defines the life of communities in the mountains and their search for greener pastures and their search for livelihood. I came across long years ago when I was dealing with the bilateral relationship between India and China, and I used to study the archives a great deal, that the only line that separated the inhabitants of Tibet from the inhabitants of the Himalayas, not a line of sovereignty, not a line drawn on a map, was the line between the pines and the bamboos. And that's really, you know, how mountain communities dealt with each other. Today, the motto, I was mentioning to a friend today, the motto of the Survey of India, which is the government agency that prepares our maps, our official maps, I'll say it's in Sanskrit, is A Setu Himachalam. That is from the Indian Ocean, that is the Adams Bridge that separates India from Sri Lanka. It's called Ram Setu in our Sanskrit language, the bridge across which Rama went to Sri Lanka to rescue his wife Sita from Ravana. So from the bridge that separates India and Sri Lanka to the peaks of the Himalayas. That is the idea of India, coming from India. I speak of it because the Himalayas, the unutterable beauty of the Himalayas, in many ways the crown of the country, really defines what we are. You know, you always speak of the diversity of India and you ask, you know, there's such a conglomeration of differences that comes together to make India. But this idea of India has been defined so much by the Himalayas. And I think when you speak of a Himalayan consensus, you have to perhaps reach across and inspire people to think of the immense potential that exists for cooperation, for coexistence, and for connectivity. You know, I know that the Chinese, and I can speak frankly now because I'm just a citizen and I do not work anymore for the government. You know, I know the Belt and Road Initiative has become a kind of flagship project for the Chinese government, and that India, as the other big country in this region, has had reservations about it. And I think these reservations, as I can see them, do not stem from the fact that there is going to be greater connectivity, but I think the reservations, and these are avoidable in many ways if we have closer political consultations on the subject and we're able to clear the fog, you know, that seems to have descended into this aspect of the relationship between India and China. The fact that the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor runs through territory which is contested between India and Pakistan is, I think, a legitimate cause for reservation by India. I think if you talk to 1.3 billion Indians, they will all say that. So I think we should be able to not only just take on board these reservations, but be prepared to discuss these, and in order to see how we can narrow the differences, build more common ground, as Premier Cho and I once very wisely said. So I believe, you know, the chapters of this book are still being written. We have not come to final conclusions as yet. The situation is fluid. South Asia, as I've always said, is an integer. We're all united. You know, whether it's Nepal, whether it's Bangladesh, whether it's India, whether it's Pakistan, whether it's Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, the Maldives, you know, we share a common destiny. And we must develop the idea of a South Asian commons crowned by the Himalaya. Thank you.